Welcome to Slight Reliability, learning SRE one day at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn SRE one day at a time. Today I'll be interviewing Joey Hendricks, who is a performance engineer working in the Netherlands, and he'll be talking about running performance testing in production, which is probably something most SREs don't do or aren't aware of as a possibility. So here's the interview, and I'll chat to you afterwards. Thank you, Joey, for joining the show on this evening for you, which I'm guessing is extremely hot given the weather currently in Europe. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself and what you do.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm very glad to be here. Longtime fan of the show. Try to listen to as many episodes as I can. Currently lagging behind a bit. I have to shamefully admit, I'm sorry. But yes, it's 40 degrees here today in Europe. So we're not built for this weather. And 40 degrees, it's piping hot, my man. But yeah, my name is Joey Hendricks. I come from the Netherlands. Not the flat part, but the somewhat more hilly part. So all the way to the south, more towards Germany. And I work for APG, which is a pension giant in our country. And I mainly work for financial clients. And I am the lead performance engineer at APG. And that's a bit my story, Stephen.
Awesome. That's really good to have you on the show. We've sort of known each other a little bit from the performance engineering days when I worked as a performance engineer. But we've never really spoken until a couple of weeks ago, actually, over a video call. So this is great. A couple of weeks ago, we called up and we were thinking about what we could talk about. And we thought of the topic of running performance testing in production, which you said the word, there's a taboo around that, and I agree. And so I think it's a great thing to talk about and something that a lot of SREs probably aren't involved in. So we had a really interesting conversation, and you brought up Plato's idea of forms and how that might relate to our testing environments. Can you, just for everyone out there who doesn't know what Plato's idea of forms is, like what is it?
Okay, so generally, if you ask most engineers and they ask you, can we run our performance test in production? They'll probably say it's a bad idea. And I have to admit, it could be. It depends completely on your context. But another bad idea, generally, is Plato's forms. It's a wacky one at best. And Stephen, do you like coffee, Stephen?
I love coffee. I'm drinking it now.
What's your favorite coffee? Cappuccino, latte macchiato? What do you like? Just black?
Honestly, I'm kind of on this low carb kick at the moment, so I can't do black coffee. So what I do, we have a coffee machine at home, and I make myself a single espresso shot, and I just fill it up with water with a dash of milk at the top. So it's not full low carb, but I got into that. I find that quite quenching, even though it sounds horrific to most people. So that's my coffee.
Great. So imagine the perfect cup of coffee, and we all now have, the listeners, you, I, we all have a cup of coffee in our head, and that's the perfect cup of coffee. Plato argues is that somewhere there's a plane of existence where that perfect cup of coffee exists, where you can actually have it. And every cup of coffee that we would make is an imperfect cup of coffee of that. And Plato argues that. I think it's a bit of a ludicrous idea, but there's probably some philosophic meaning behind it that I might fly right over my head. However, I find it a bit, when I connect this back to IT, and I connect this to testing environments, performance engineers, performance testers, and I think also a bit about SRE, when we want to measure performance of a system, we always tend to try it in a testing environment, which 9 out of 10 times can result in an imperfect copy of production. And for us engineers, there is no plane of existence that's going to house production that is inaccessible and unreal. We can actually access it, and we could do stuff with it. So I really like the idea of forms and bring it into the performance engineering space, because we can actually access it. We couldn't access that eluded perfect cup of coffee, because that might be in a completely different plane of existence, but we can access production, which is our perfect environment. It's the perfect setup.
I think, and I think this whole idea that testing environments or performance testing environments, even if they're called production-like, are getting more and more difficult to even approach what production is like, because we have more and more complex distributed systems. And so it's not just about having the bit and scaling it up and having the right data, which is really hard in itself. You might have 20 different systems and components interacting with each other, and the data has to be in sync between them, and it just gets out of control. And like, even if you align everything perfectly, as Plato would say, into the perfect imitation of the form, it's still, you just don't know. You just don't know what you don't know. There could be something wrong.
It could be that we look at it and we think it's perfect, and then maybe 3 months down the line, we find an imperfection, and we didn't know, and we're like, oh no, we didn't know. So I like this. There can always be an imperfection inside your production-like testing environment, which can make it not production-like anymore. And of course, infrastructure as code and some DevOps principles, they help in reducing this, and that you actually can get an environment that is production-like-ish. But like you said, there is so much complexity around these environments. It could be very well that you get the imperfect one. So then we discuss, like, we tell people that Plato tells people that there's this plane of existence, and there's that cup of coffee that we all think is there, the perfect one, and we cannot reach it. It's physically impossible. And there's a certain taboo, a certain red tape around production and doing something in production, testing, or even accessing it from a technical perspective, that could be that barrier between you. But in our world, we can break that barrier. And to be able to break that barrier is difficult. It requires trust. It requires a lot of knowledge. Functional and technical aspects need to be deeply understood before you would even attempt such a thing. And I think that production testing is a double-edged sword. It could go horribly wrong if you don't know what you're doing. But if you know how to wield that sword properly, you can definitely get some value out of it. And you can definitely mitigate risks out of it.
Okay. So if there's someone out there who's thinking, wow, that's a cool idea, I would love to be able to performance test in production, what would they need to start thinking about to bring that to reality? What considerations are there? What do they need to do?
So first of all, start understanding your application. Start understanding about the business behind it, right? What am I doing? What am I accessing? Am I accessing certain, when I access a certain part of my application, let's say if I search a customer, is that, I think then, right, I'm doing a search as a read-only call, but is that really a read-only call, or is there still some logging happening? That it logs this person searched this one for auditing purposes. Could be that it's there. Right? So you have to understand very well how your application is working. And depending on that context, you can make or break it. You can say like, if I do that, it's actually a right call. If I do this and that, and knowing that and knowing how that application functionally and technically works is a very good information anyways to have as a tester or as a SRE, that you know the context that you're working in, but how everything intertwines and clicks into each other is definitely a knowledge that you need to have before you need to attempt this. Like I said, it's a double-edged sword if you don't know how to wield it. You'll cut yourself. And that's also the dangerous part in production. It's you have to know what you're doing, and you have to know your application, you have to know your context. And that's not something easy to build up, that knowledge. It can take years, depending on the complexity of your organization, before you have enough knowledge to really encompass the scale and the complexity and the intricacies that can be in your system. But once you have a solid grasp on that, or you know about it and you have learned about it, then production testing becomes kind of like that red tape holding you back. It's like, yeah, but I know if I do this and this and that, it won't affect production. I can design my test in such a way that it will not affect it. And I know, and bringing the application down, for example, with my load test, performance test in production is also not possible, because I know that my application can handle, for example, 4,000 calls per minute. Let's say an arbitrary number, right? And I'm only testing up to 1,000 or 500, and I know it can handle it. And if it can't handle it, then we have a bigger problem than that the test broke the environment. That meant that if I didn't test it, 12 hours later, when maybe actual users would start using the website, they would experience a bad digital experience. And I could have prevented that if I tested early, got a warning system and say like, hey folks, we have a problem. The test shows an immense delta up to compared to yesterday. We have to do something. Stuff's on fire.
You were saying before about how you can design your tests in such a way that they won't have an impact on production and real customers and users. Have you ever seen the flip side of it where you might design something in the system to help you with that? For example, maybe you create some rule where if you pass a particular header, then it won't like log audit logs for that particular transaction or that kind of thing. Have you ever seen anything like that before?
I haven't seen it, but that would be great. So that you would have, for example, for testing purposes, that your application is built for allowing more, how can I say, streams of observability, right? That I say, for example, I have 20 REST calls, like service calls that can enter into my application. And I say like, okay, if I give the specific header, it won't register or do certain things that I don't want to do. And that's engineering your application to make it testable. That's certainly a great idea, but I haven't seen it. And it's also something, I think, new, arbitrary, and a bit like, should production even have that? Isn't that only for test? That's the kind of attitude that you would usually see. But it's very well possible. In the end, production is the best testing environment that we could have. It's the perfect one.
I think that's one of the criteria for software we just don't value enough, which is testability. And even, a lot of organizations, they don't necessarily build all the software from scratch. They purchase it. But if I'm purchasing software, I want to know, is it actually testable from an API, UI, data, in all those different levels? And I don't think that is, it's not ranked highly enough in the criteria.
Yeah, for sure. It's I think that testability or observability that you can get out of your application is that should be built in. I think that's something that might become more relevant as the years tick by. But most old Java monolith applications that run in the backdoor of some old dusty financial institution might not have that. I haven't seen it myself, but it's certainly possible to do this and to also engineer existing applications to do this.
So obviously, if you're going to do performance tests in production, I'm guessing one of the key things is that you don't actually impact real production data and muck up real customers and that kind of thing. So do you only ever test read-only kind of transactions, or do you have a way of testing write or update transactions, but then you can reverse them? Like, how do you deal with that?
I think if your application is designed to be testable and to be tested in production, and that when designing your application, you think about that you could do write transaction. But I think in 90% of the cases, and what many of us will face, is that that's not possible, and getting that such a feature on the board might be difficult. However, and also, again, in most cases, when you have a write call, right, it starts updating something, gets thrown on a queue, and then gets picked up, right? The user's experience is usually like get a 200 in half a second, and that's always fast because it's active in queue, or it's some other queuing software that replies relatively quickly. It's just like, here's your request. We're gonna do it. However, with read-only calls, that's usually the part of your traffic that is the most intense on your system, and also the most traffic. And it all depends on your context. What I have seen is that I usually read-only calls is the biggest pool of the biggest volume. I don't know how that is in your experience, Stephen.
I mean, I work in insurance, and a lot of the insurance platforms, you really would need to do some kind of writing. So you might not create an actual customer with... you probably would have to, you would need customers because you need to at least create insurance quotes, because it's that quoting process that calculates the price and the underwriting rules. That's where all the heavy lifting is. So you'd need to do that bit. So, and that's not read only because it's creating a quote. It might be a quote that only is a temporary object in the database and it gets removed after a month if you don't take it any further, but it's still creating data. So it's kind of challenging in that context, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like I said, it's a double-edged sword, and it's something that has a delicate balance to it. Production testing, because you could do it, right? You could say, okay, I'm going to do it, and I am going to have some mutable information inside my database. But if I know that it's not going to be an impact, and if I then run a job that would quickly delete them, And I can do that through business and legal ways that it doesn't impact the functional aspect as well. Because you also have to think about that, because it could be very well that you just can't do it from a legal point. Think about GDPR, that kind of points where you just can't do it. We might have to enter sensitive client information where it doesn't make sense. You can't do it because of some legal repercussions that you might face as an organization.
So you are, just so we're clear, Joey's running performance tests in production. Just quickly, how often are you running them? Is it every day?
I run them every day. So you have to understand that then when you're going to decide when you're going to run them, that you also have solutions in place. For example, like an APM solution where you can actually see traffic happening, right? Good monitoring solutions are also one of the key pillars that you need before you're going to start even attempting this or even thinking about it. If you don't have that, then please do not do this. But if you have, for example, an APM solution installed, you'll see the traffic, you'll see the ups and downs of the regular day. And this also depends on your context, completely what kind of organization you are. You can find moments in a day that your application is underutilized there, where you could say like, okay, that's actually a perfect moment to start sampling or to do a sample. And you could do that in half an hour, 15 minutes. You just bump it up, get some samples from production, and then leave. Right? Or you could use synthetic monitoring to, for example, sample every 5 minutes with one user and keep track of that and see if your system remains stable over longer periods of time. So these kinds of tests can be done. And I like to just run them daily as a sort of snapshot of how production looks today.
And is that sort of an overnight thing or early in the morning? I'm guessing it's outside of traditional business hours.
Yeah, exactly. It's most of these gaps that you'll see in these kinds of applications is that you'll see them early in the morning or late in the evening, where you'll have outside of maintenance windows, where you'll see that, okay, that's in half an hour I can take because it's like nobody uses the application then. And it depends on your context. If that's the truth, you're Netflix, then your application's being used 24/7, and finding such a dip in traffic is quite difficult. But most people don't work for Netflix.
No, and then you're probably, it's not probably considered one massive system. You'd probably find a time within a particular cluster or region, and you'd have to focus on testing that if you wanted to do it, as opposed to the entire global solution, which is probably near impossible to performance test for something like Netflix, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly.
You were talking about synthetic transactions, because a lot of SREs who are listening will be very familiar with synthetic transactions as part of their monitoring and observability approach. But I think it's important to note that the limitations around those, that you have one thread like continually checking the health of something, that's great, but it's a single sample. Whereas what you're talking about is running, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of requests against the system. It's not happening all the time, but you're getting a much better sense of how it behaves under load, confidence because of the number of samples you're seeing, that kind of thing. It's a different kind of test. And there's something to be said for having confidence in numbers and not. And I'm a bit sort of dubious about synthetic transactions because of that. Like, I think they are a valuable thing to supplement other kinds of observability, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on synthetic transactions?
Yeah, synthetic transactions are great. So you could leverage, for example, existing load tests also for this. If you have, for example, a project that goes through clicks through the application, right, and it falls back on those pillars that I gave earlier. That you look at how once you're comfortable at running with one user in production, then you're also usually comfortable with scaling it up to, let's say, 100. But when we have those assets, they are usually ready to go. So you can just use them to measure, for example, empirically with one user with the same data constantly. Hey, what is production doing? What kind of a sample do I have? And then you store that, and you keep storing that, and you keep storing that until you get huge trend lines of how an application is behaving. Because if I'm constantly giving static data, I'm constantly same customer number. It could be a mock customer or whatever what we could do, right? And you keep hitting that customer every time, and it should respond with the same performance. Because we should understand that the system should always respond within the same broadband. But that's usually not the case. You'll see that once performance gains or losses are implemented through technical depth, that you'll see that these curves, they start ditching down or up. right? We might be improving as a whole, as a service, or as a service, or as a website, or whatever you're monitoring through synthetic means, that it might go trending upwards or downwards. And those are great ways to indicate, are we going towards the good spectrum or are we going towards the bad spectrum? So that's also very great. It's a great monitoring tool. And you could for sure use your load test for it too.
After you've run all these load tests and you're getting all of this information coming back, which you can analyze, what do you do with that? What value does it provide in your particular context?
So for example, I'm a bit of a statistics geek, and I kind of became one when I became a performance engineer, because numbers is everything. It's latency, hardware utilizations. It all boils down to numbers. And I came, for example, and this is the topic that I had for last year's pack, is that we had the problem that we had a lot of tests running, and we wanted to also analyze them automatically, because getting your tests to run automatically is not that hard. It's just scheduling the load runner, JMeter, or whatever tool you're using as a load thrower. But that data that comes out of it, that's gold. So what we ended up doing was taking that data and actually starting to analyze it automatically using statistics, comparing A versus B, and then calculating the delta. And not in a arbitrary way where we would say like, if it's above the SLA, we will pass or fail it. No, we would look to actual statistical difference. How much distance is between A and B? And if that's too big, and we would create a giant matrix of all kinds of statistical numbers that go in there. And if it doesn't meet the criteria that we have set, it can either be then, for example, that we have we used letter ranks to determine if S is very good, there's no difference between them, and the lower you would go from S, A, B, C, D, E, F, the worse it will become, the higher the delta. It's a great metric to start showing that to business owners or product owners or teams, because they'll understand the letter rank. And the math that goes behind it is immensely complicated. But it would allow me to basically automatically do a very high-end analysis and then put it into a pipeline. That's for my performance testing part, is that really great. However, when we then go to production testing, where I have a sample of production, always on the same time, in the same conditions, I can compare that too. And if I get deltas on that, then we have a whole nother story. Because if I calculate and I see, I have a delta of, let's say, a B, and that a B is usually 5 to 10% reduction in performance or instability that has occurred, then the test will pick up, the comparison will pick up on that, and it will then report a lower rank or a lower score. I also score them from 0 to 100. I kind of say to the teams, what do you want? Do you want a ladder rank or a score? Both are accurate. It's what you want. So you could use that data then, the score or the ladder rank, to basically drive I have a problem in production because my system is now going backwards compared to yesterday, or compared to last week, or compared to the month ago. Plus, I have so much samples that I can create detailed trend lines. See if I can still, how is it going? And I have more numbers to work with, and I can calculate more accurate statistics that I could maybe not do with other tooling. So it's a great way to just create a statistical sample in production and say okay, over time, through my sample, and I've done that then for a year, I can say very comfortably we're going this direction. The system is improving. And those are very great metrics to give back to the business, because that's the system that counts. If I tell them, test environments are improving, and we know that they can be imperfect, then what am I really reporting then? But in production, I'm reporting the actual point, where I'm leveraging my production tests to create more observability, because when they fail and the comparison ticks and says, there's something wrong here, it starts flipping out and starts automatically sending alerts to the relevant teams saying hey, our stuff is on fire, prepare for a bad day. So lately I've been thinking to create this more like a weather forecast and actually put little weather symbols next to it on a dashboard and say it's going to thunder today because the delta is 50%, or we have more outliers than usual. That kind of that. So you have a weather forecast in the early mornings of production is still operating well or not, completely based on the sample. Probably.
Many years ago, I wrote a blog called The Myth of Continuous Performance Testing, and it was like the thing which started me creating content, and people were like either outraged or interested in it, and that was great, right? And I basically was saying you can't automate performance testing for many reasons properly, and one of my biggest points was you can't auto-analyze the results. A couple of things of what you just said. I don't understand statistics enough to really. That's probably why I shied away from that, right? But it sounds. I mean, it sounds like you found an approach here. But what makes me think, yes, I accept what you're doing. It makes sense to me. Is it's just a flag and indicator to say, hey, there's been a change here, and then you still have all the raw data. And I know because I know you that you'll look at scatter plots and see the raw data and trends and things. So. I can buy into that. What I don't buy into still is we have an automated deployment pipeline and all of our performance is packaged into it, and we get a green or a red, and that's it. Like I don't buy into that. But you're not doing that, so that's okay.
No, not at all. Everything is the checks that we do. For example, if you talk about performance testing on the side of acceptation pre-prod testing, these checks are very rigorous. So when they fail. They will only fail if there's a significant detail, but they can easily go on review because they have 3 statuses. So they will only go for manual review, and if they're on manual review, it found an anomaly that it cannot understand. For example, a difference in outliers, an influx in errors, the test duration suddenly changing, something that doesn't compute, doesn't create the perfect laboratory environment to compare A with B, and that makes the analysis less valuable. And then I will put it on review, which then sends an email to me, looking that I should look at the raw data. I also look at the raw data every day because I test in production. So when a release happens, I do a sanity check and I see it's working perfectly. So I also have these dashboards ready to go to always look at them, but I can't always look at them. And then it's the automatic analysis that can pick up the slack there when I don't have time to look at it. So that's how we focus there most of our attention to.
How are you doing the statistical analysis part? Are you writing your own code to do it, or are you using a tool to do it?
I write my own code. So everything is written in Python. Everything is written in Python. So we use Python to analyze the data. So we just we have this data then stored into a database, and then we just access it and compare it to the latest baseline that we have available. And then we say, like, okay, we like this, then it meets the criteria, and then it kind of gets a green or a red flag. And these are rigorous checks. These are usually made out of calculations that look like Elvish. And I think that most of them, if I would have to explain them now how they work, I wouldn't know it anymore. Yeah. But they're expressly used for these kinds of distance testing. Like, I want to know if A is different than B. It's the same how they do this in medicine. If they have 2 populations, the one population of people that are getting the placebo and one they're getting the actual medicine, and then they compare like the numbers to each other to see if it's actually had an effect or not. That's the same kind of math that I'm using to check whether if there's something different or not.
And I guess this would only work in this context of running this performance test every day, because you're controlling a lot of the variables. You're using the same data, same time, same load. You probably wouldn't be able to do the same thing by just observing real customers in production, taking all the data and then applying. Yeah.
No, that's the caveat. If you want to do this kind of stuff, and I've been thinking with the idea, like, what if you could just like take the information out of your APM solution and just compare that to the latest hour? Would that be good enough, or would that analysis just go completely insane and be inaccurate? You never know. But because I'm always in a laboratory situation where I have A and B in the same conditions, that makes a perfect comparison where I can actually trust that my comparison is equal, giving me the ability to raise a flag when something's wrong in production, or do pre-prod. When I'm doing pre-prod testing, I can put it into a pipeline and flag it down when I see something weird, when I'm not looking myself.
Okay. 2 more questions. My first question is, let's say your test is running in production and it's terrible. Like the score comes up F. What happens in that moment?
Well, when we have APM installed. So most organizations have APM installed, right? They're on their production application systems, and And because when you then actually do a load test in production, and the moment comes that we do a load test in production, and the samples are collected, and then you flag and say teams, oh no, we have a problem. There's a bunch of more errors than there wasn't there before. We need to do something. Then teams, because APM is installed, it captured that moment. It's there. It's recorded. It's instantly. People can instantly start debugging. The moment that the mail comes, they can hop on AppDynamics and start looking at the data, saying, oh, shouldn't be there. Why is that node not working properly? It's instantly debugging. It's not first scouring logs, because APM solutions are great because you can instantly dive into problem-solving mode. But because we captured the problem in a situation where it really didn't impact any actual users, it just impacted our test, and that's where it's intended. It's intended to find problems. And if it happens, we have a recording. We have the samples. We have the information. You can hop on, debug, fix the problem, and that before actual users start really noticing the problem and having a bad user experience.
I'm going to finish with an incredibly silly question because that's what we've been doing recently. So my question is, if you could have a choice between being able to turn invisible or you're invincible, so that basically nothing can physically harm you in any way, which would you choose? Look, it's a serious question, man. Come on.
Yeah. You'll get a serious answer, Stephen. I think invincible for if you really mess up during production testing and somebody throws a keyboard at you, at least it doesn't hurt.
What sort of keyboards are they using?
I don't know. You might have those, these 90-year-old these 90s keyboard that weigh like 8 kilos that you would plug into your Commodore 64.
Just wanted to do a big thank you to Joey for that interview. On the day that we were recording, it had been 40 degrees Celsius in the Netherlands, which I know from experience is extraordinarily uncomfortable. So thank you so much for enduring the heat and talking to us about performance testing and production. That's all from another episode of Slight Reliability. I'll be back next week. See you all next time.